Before we begin the keynote address, I too want to talk a little bit about situating and contextualizing our time together today. Today's conference theme is unpacking inequities through an intersectional lens. It is not possible to talk about inequities without naming the place and time where we are at right now and the communities around us and what they are enduring. The murder of George Floyd and the current trial, the attacks on Asian communities across the nation, but also right here in our own neighborhoods, and the ways in which race, class, location, and the positionality of our first-gen students are tied up in the many injustices of living in a pandemic. These lenses are integral to our discussions here today. We know that first-gen students come to us in all their multiplicity, their complexity, their navigational and resistance capital. We recognize their assets and reject the deficit narrative, but we also recognize that they are coming into institutions that are not designed for them. So I want to differentiate between intersecting identities and the intersectionality of systemic barriers. Marilyn Frye, when writing about oppression, used the analogy of the birdcage. She wrote, "If you look closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by this myopic focus, you could look up that wire up and down and not be able to see why the bird could not fly around it. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that you see why the bird does not go anywhere, and then you see it in an instant." So to consider the first-gen experience through an intersectional lens is to see that race, class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, ability, age operate not as unitary, mutually exclusive identities and entities, but as reciprocally constructing phenomena that in turn shape complex social inequalities. I know that this lens has shaped and informed the work of our two keynote speakers, so let me now introduce them. Some of you may already know Dr. Becky Martinez, who has worked closely with our campus on the Go for Equity project. Welcome back. Dr. Martinez is a consultant and trainer with an emphasis on social justice, leadership, and organizational development. Her work focuses on engaging individuals and groups to recognize systemic dynamics of privilege and oppression to create more inclusive, equitable policies, practices, and structures. She's a faculty member with the Social Justice Training Institute, a co-lead facilitator for leadership, a board member of Class Action, and the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Educational Network. She shares that she is a proud first-generation college student raised in a working-class family. And if you don't know Professor Sonja Ardoin, trust me, you are going to want to know her. Sonja Ardoin, PhD, is a learner, educator, facilitator, and author, proud of her hometown of Vidrine, Louisiana, her working class Cajun roots, and her first-gen college student to PhD journey. Sonja holds degrees from LSU, Florida State, and NC State, and she considers herself a scholar practitioner of higher education. She has served as an administrator for 10 years before shifting to faculty role in 2015. Together, they are co-editors of a powerful new book, Straddling Class in the Academy. Sonja and Becky remind us in this book, reflecting on Bell Hook's words, that profound observation that nowhere is there a more intense silence about the realities of class differences than in educational settings. And I know we'll spend some time unpacking that today. Please join me in welcoming these two wonderful speakers. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, and good morning, good morning. We are going to switch slides. I am Dr. Becky Martinez, she, her, and hers, and humbled, honored, excited to be here in this space, connecting across screen in something that is so near and dear to what I do, who I am, how I navigate the world. And I am lucky and excited to be here with my good friend and colleague that I will let her introduce herself.
Good morning. Good morning, y'all. My name is Sonja. I also use she, her pronouns, and additionally feel very connected to this topic because I grew up in a working class family, in a working class town, in one of the poorest parish in terms of poverty. We use parishes in Louisiana, not counties. So that one of the poorest parishes in the country, in the state and in the country. And so this has a personal meaning to me, but also how I've seen it impact my own experience, but also the experiences of others in higher education. And so that's my sphere. And so that is sort of where I focus my work in this area. And it is always a joy and pleasure to work alongside my colleague, Dr. Becky Martinez.
Awesome, thank you. You know, I feel like Dean Rodriguez, you and I could just sit down and have a conversation. So we appreciate that opening. We appreciate the connection. We appreciate the vulnerability and the leadership that was just happened. I was like, I want to hear this person talk more. And we're here to engage in this conversation around considering how social class influences our work in higher education. And for us, it even extends beyond higher education, right? It is in our homes, at the grocery store, how we think and what we feel about this pandemic, right? All of the things that impact how social class shows up. And so appreciate Dean Rodriguez really talking about indigeneity and Indigenous folks and support of Indigenous communities. So we just want to continue to uplift that through the institution's recognition of Indigenous lands, right? And so the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. And we are part of that institution, right? And so what is our work? As we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion and Indigenous folks and what we know and what we don't know. So I just want us to take a deep breath as we think about that. Is it something that I pay attention to? How is it more than putting up a slide? Right? What do I know about my Indigenous community? How can I support my Indigenous community? And with that, we've got the quote that was just talked about, right? So nowhere is there more intense silence about the reality of social class differences than in educational settings. We could have a session just on this, right? And we want you to take that in, and you can put stuff in chat like, what does this mean for you? Right? When you see this, how do you see class play out or not play out? As we think about that intense silence, I often say we never talk about class and we always talk about class. And so being able to hold that both and, right? We have been taught not to talk about class, right? We have been taught not to talk about money, and yet I talk about who's driving what all the time. Right? Or what I eat, or how I speak. Is it a professional to sit here and say shit? Right? Do I need to say Dr. Becky Martinez or not? Right? And so the ways in which class plays itself out, and in higher education, right, that has steeped in classism and elitism, and how do we talk about it? Right? And so appreciate this opportunity to be able to do so. Right? We have a couple of polls that we want to gather some information from you all so that this could be as interactive as possible across the screen. And so with that, we're going to have the folks that are doing the polls pull those up. How comfortable are you engaging in social class? And I'm going to actually have Sonja engage with our polls in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you see the poll on the screen, feel free to sort of select the sort of option that is most aligned with your reaction. So we know that in sort of the forced choice here. It might not precisely align with your perspective, but the one that is most closely aligned. So take a minute and sort of go with your gut reaction, not the reaction maybe you think people want to hear or that you should be saying, but the actual sort of response and action there. So the first question here is, how comfortable are you engaging with social class? And you'll see options of not doing it, no thank you, right? I was taught that that is not an appropriate conversation topic among with, several others. Only if you force me, right? Like, you're making me talk about this today in this keynote. So, okay, I will, because you're making me. I can talk theory with comfort, but not more than that. So maybe some of us have intellectualized social class, and we will talk a little bit about theory today, but for some folks, they're only comfortable in that theoretical space. I engage in basic conversation with students, but I tend to avoid social class topics with colleagues. So thinking it as a sort of a student-rooted issue versus a more systemic issue in higher education. I'm comfortable and willing to engage in most workspaces. So most rooms I'm in, most committees I'm on, those sorts of things. Or let's do it all the time, right? As Dr. Martinez just said, at work, at home, at the grocery store, standing in line to get my vaccine, whatever, right? I'm comfortable talking about it. We'll leave that open for about 10 more seconds. If we want to close that poll and show folks the results.
Or not.
Yeah, I know. Maybe we can't see the results. Oh, there we go.
There we
Thank
go.
you. Oh, great. So we have about more than half of folks who are willing and comfortable engaging in most workspaces. That's fantastic. And somewhat rare, I would say, with this sort of second here of yes, all the time. So if we sort of add those together, we have about 75% of folks who are like, yeah, let's do it. So awesome, fantastic. Glad you're in the space today. And for those of you who are in other spaces, that's okay too. We're all entering the conversation from different sort of vantage points. And the fact that you're here tells me that you're at least willing to sort of engage and listen. And so we appreciate everybody being here with that today. We have one more poll, so I'll ask us to launch the next poll, which is really about what do we associate with social class? And so sort of this connection point between hearing sort of the term or the word social class and what our brain immediately goes to. So what we are socialized to believe and associate with social class. And so you'll see here money and finances, home ownership, which you may say, well, that's tied to money and finances. It is, right? But it might be sort of the different place where your mind goes. Healthcare and other benefits. I'm getting my second vaccine today. What does that mean? Why do I have access to that? That's readily easy to me and other people might not. Educational level. So have you had the opportunity to engage in formal education? What has that meant for you? Work and occupation. So do we automatically associate social class with what somebody does to sort of make their living? And then clothes and shoes. So do we also associate it with sort of brands or types, right? So what do we believe about somebody who wears work boots to go to their employment versus somebody who wears shiny shoes, right? And those sorts of things. So depending on how you've been socialized, one of these may come up first for you as you think about social class identity. So I'll give you about 10 more seconds to put in your polling here with what you first associate with social class. All right, we will close that poll and show the results when they come up. Awesome. Money and finances, yes, 68%. That is absolutely the most common thing. And it is how often we try to address social class in higher education, is we think if we make it free, if we have a scholarship, that fixes everything. And it fixes some stuff. It absolutely does, but it doesn't fix everything. And so how do we understand the money and finances part, but know that's only sort of one element of social class identity? We see about 20% with work and occupation here. And I think that's interesting too, because I had a conversation with some students the other day. We were talking about salaries, job salaries, even in higher education, and how much it, what does it mean to be a faculty member? People automatically assume you're going to make a lot of money. I make $65,000. That's a good salary in my opinion, but it's different, right, than my colleagues who stay in administration and may have a sort of different financial trajectory based on that role. What are our campus custodians making in higher education? What are our IT folks making? What does it mean? And so we can look at work and occupation even within the higher ed sphere and sort of see this sort of hierarchical differentiation based on what we value in term or how we value people's contributions in higher education. They're all valuable, and we place sort of differential value on those. So yes, we automatically assume money and social class, and there are other parts too. And so I'll kick it back over to Dr. Martinez, who's going to sort of tease that out for us a little bit.
Yeah, somebody had put into the chat life experiences, right? When they think of social class, they think about life experiences. And that's what we're going to have some time talking about right now is what is social class identity? We get asked that a lot, right? Like, what is the definition? Give me the model or the theory, or just break it up into like numbers. So like, what is the middle class, right? Or what is low class? Or is it okay if we say poor, or if we say owning class? And so there's all of this, again, stuff usually related to money and assets. And as somebody had said, right, life experiences. So we know that social class is so much more than economic capital, which is how people enter the conversation, right? Salary, right? Home, right? Do you own or rent? What do you drive? What do you wear? How do you vacation? What does your retirement plan look like? What does vesting mean? So the economic capital piece. And that's where people enter it. And that's part of it and so much more, right? And so even as we think about social capital, right? And social capital is who you know, right? It is that networking, it is that mentoring, it is that, Rashné, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, right? Knows Sonja, knows the book, and invited us to be here today. Like, that's how social capital works. Right? And as folks, as I grew up working class, I didn't know exactly what that meant in academia. Right? I knew what that meant in regards to the barter system of fixing a car, right? Or needing something in the space that I grew up. And so it felt and landed on me differently in a social capital space. And then you have cultural capital. So what is it that you know, right? What is the information that you know? How do you work systems and know systems? Many times I am the caller to system stuff with my parents because I know how to navigate it. I know the information to say, I know the words to use. I know that when I get on the phone, I say, this is Dr. Martinez. And they're like, oh, yes, and I'm here to talk about this situation with my parents. And so this cultural capital piece is really critical, at least for me in navigating systems beyond just myself. But as we think about students, what cultural capital are they bringing to campus that may not be the norm, right, in higher education? And we have a linguistic capital, right? We have academic capital, how we talk, right? What degrees we have, where we have them from, what our topics were, those pieces. So we have those components. And as social classes continue to be researched and written about, we know that is also expanding. So that's, that top square and more, I'm curious to know what the more is going to be as we continue this work. And so ways it plays itself out, some of them I've talked about, some of them Sonja talked about as we think about shoes, right? Who has steel-toed work boots, right? And, who has Sonja, the shiny shoes. I'm not sure that I've ever heard you say that, so I appreciate that, right? Language, accents, and it's a conversation that Sonja and I have a lot, right? As we think about accents and what that means and whose accent is smarter, which is also a part of class, right? And whose isn't, right? And there's, I think, also the intersection in regards to then race and ethnicity of, so whose accent do we think we pay attention to and don't think about immigration status, right? And don't think about their family connection to the US. And then those that we do are like, they got this accent. And then profanity, right? Who can say what in front of a screen full of professionals? And then how do I talk when I am with my family? And so how many times can I say bullshit, right, without people being like, she shouldn't say that. And then we have who you know and what you know, right? We already talked about that. And who knows you? So it's not just who you know, but who knows you. Like, so who knows Sonja's name out there in academia or as an administrator that's going to bring Sonja to campus to talk about all of the brilliant work that she does. Teeth and other forms of healthcare. Right? Who has teeth? I have a friend who always used to say, if you can afford teeth, get teeth. My mother has really bad dental work. And so she had her whole top teeth recently done and it cost some money and they had to save, but otherwise she would have no teeth. Right? And there is a way that that lands on people. When you take your shower, do you take your shower in the morning, right, as you get ready for work, or do you take your shower in the evening after you've done work? And so those little things, I never thought about that until I was at a session and somebody brought that up. And I was like, my dad has always taken a shower at night. Right? Like, I paid attention to who in my family showers at night. Right? And it is hard laborers. It is people who are laboring differently than how I, as a first generation white collar professional, labor. And then where you eat, right? What you eat, sweetbreads, right? Or bone marrow. I used to think about that, right? Now bone marrow costs like $50, and so in this bougie restaurant and this little plate, and there have been communities of color and poor communities that have been eating, right, these particular foods for years because it was the scraps. And now it has become something that, you know, again, you pay $50 for that appetizer. So again, what you eat and where you eat it, in the lunchroom, who has a lunchroom, right? Or a break room, or somebody in their office, or somebody that is working in our residence halls, eating in the lobby, because that is where they need to eat. And then educational attainment. So again, the ways that social class play itself out beyond just a money space that we have to start paying attention to. Sonja and I are here to pull the thread in the tapestry, right? And so pulling the thread around class in the tapestry around identity, intersections, DE&I. And as we think about social class, right, the ways in which we experience it, and the kind of that we have these, social class identities in these three different realms. So there's class of origin. There is what we have been born into, what our family was like when we were young, what that structure was, what all that last slide was in regards to class of origin, how we grew up. And then there is the current or felt class. And so, now that I'm Dr. Martinez, life is a little bit different. It is maybe what I earn, how I speak, the degrees that I have, right? How I feel it, what I'm currently living in regards to my social class identity. And then there's attributed, and what's put, so that one is always the interesting, is what's put on us, right? What's put on us if they don't know my title, right? Or what's put on us if they know that we don't work at the university, right? What's put on us in regards to what we drive or how we eat, or if we bring our lunch, or if we go out to lunch, right? When we get back to campus. And so what is put on us as we think about working in higher education? What's often attributed is that the class of origin is at least middle income, right? Or at least middle class. So if you work on a college campus, your class of income or your class of origin is at least middle class. And that's such a myth, right? Or that we're making, Sonja, I appreciate you telling us your salary, because we usually don't get to that. Like, ooh, she said her salary. We're not supposed to do that, right? She told her salary, and now I know, but I thought it was this, right? And so what is put on us, all of those pieces are part of our social class identity. And what is really important is they're not working in a silo. Right? They are working at the same time. And that's really where our book came from as we think about straddling class. right? People who grew up poor, working class, and their classes changed, or in addition to their class has happened because of degrees, because of jobs. And then what is put on folks? And so these three don't work in silos. They're all connected. And I appreciate something popped in the chat that says, and what is hard work? Again, that's something that we could talk about for this entire session. As we say hard work, what does that mean? As we say labor, what does that mean? As we say professional, what does that mean? Because I think the people who do landscaping are professionals, that I am not going to do that labor, right? Or people that are planting, like are doing our agriculture, like planting our food, professional, but we don't name them as such. And so even being able to stretch or reconfigure or reimagine these particular descriptors, these markers that exist. And as we engage and think about, so here's some pieces of social class identity. Here is maybe where am I at, and we're gonna give you some time to get to that space of reflection. We also want to provide some theory. It's some theory of how class plays itself out.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I appreciate sort of this conversation about how it's messy, right? So like there are some things from my class of origin that I maintain that people, my colleagues in academia, it doesn't make sense to them. Like it challenges the way they believe about social class, that you're either one or the other, that you can't be both at the same time. And so I think that I often tell a story about my car because it's a 2009 Toyota Corolla. And when I bought it, I was insistent that it had roll-up windows, like manual windows and manual locks. And I still have that car. It actually got repainted because of a recall, so I'm pumped about that. And I plan to ride it till it dies because that is how I grew up with vehicles. And so people now get into my car and are like, "This is ridiculous, Sonja," because they make the assumption that because I work in higher ed and because I make an okay salary, like that I should just go get a new car. And I'm like, there's no reason to get a new car. My car runs, it has air conditioning, and it has a radio. That's all I need in a car. And so thinking, about some of those things, or about sort of how you choose to spend your time, or there's all kinds of sort of pieces that maintain that are challenging, I think, for people to sort of understand about the straddling component, and not just for ourselves, but also for the students that we work with. And they are literally straddling class as they sort of deal with or manage, right, sometimes different worlds of their home community and the campus community that they are a part of. And right now, at the same time, if students are learning virtually and are in their home space, that is exacerbated in some ways as well. So there's sort of two models that we've used to frame some of the work that we have done. Terayasso's community cultural wealth model is not a social class model, right? It is a model, a critical race theory model, particularly around Latinx students. And so we own and honor that it was not created for this purpose. And a lot of folks who study social class have used it because there are similar tenets in some of these sort of framings of capital that allow us to also understand social class. And so you see sort of the money, income, wealth part at the top there that we've already talked about. Dr. Martinez has talked about the cultural capital piece there as well, and the social capital, but wanting to think about sort of these broader ways of understanding capital from an asset-based lens. So instead of saying, oh, well, students don't have this or don't have that, to Dean Rodriguez's points earlier about how do we become ready for them versus trying to fix a student, how do we fix the system? Because students don't need to be fixed. They don't need to be fixed, right? Students are full and vivacious and promising. And it's our systems that are broken, the systems that we've created. And so how do we think about harnessing all of these assets that students bring with them from their families and the familial capital they've already shown us they have aspiration. If a student who identifies as poor working class and or first gen and or students of color and or students with disabilities come to our campuses, they have already said, right, I have aspiration and I'm capable of navigating systems that were not made for me in order to be here. So they've already shown us that they have these forms of capital. Same thing with resistant capital. They've already shown us, hey, this system was not made for me and often views me in a deficit lens, but I'm still here. So the mere presence of students on our campus that hold minoritized identities show us they have aspirational and resistant capital. We've already talked some about linguistic capital as well. The navigational capital is about navigating systems. Again, if a student has come to our campus, it has shown us that they have navigated the financial aid system, they've navigated the admission system. And so we know that they have the ability to do all these things. Our job is to make it easier so they do not have to keep laboring and laboring and laboring more than their peers in order to be successful, earn their degree at our institutions. And so for us, it's thinking about students have all these wonderful things. How do we harness that? But also then how do we build better systems to where it is easier for, or not even easier, but it is more equitable for students to be able to access those systems. So lots of, and I think we also make some assumptions. I had a good conversation with somebody the other day about families and how sometimes we view families in an adversarial way on college campuses, or we make the assumption that first-gen families or poor and working class families don't want their students to be with us. And that is true in some cases, but that's not true in the majority of cases, I would say. I would say what I have seen in my own life, but also anecdotally in working with students on multiple campuses, is that their families do support them. They support them in the ways they are able. They show up, they want to help them in the capacities that they have. And so I think about familial capital as my grandfather holding my undergraduate diploma and saying, I never thought I'd get to hold one of these in my whole life. I think about it as the student when I was at Texas A&M who waited for 20 members of his family to show up before he would get his Aggie ring, because he said, it's ours, it's not just mine. And so how do we understand that familial capital that is sort of rooting and encouraging students to maintain and seek success on our campuses? So seeing families as partners versus seeing them sort of as adversaries or as sort of inconsequential to students' pathways. So that's one model. The other model that we often use to frame our work is William Liu's social class worldview model, which is a model that was specifically created to understand social class. And this is sort of one element of the model. There is this is sort of from the 2004 version of the model. There's also a 2011 version of the model. But it essentially shows us that sort of that central part in the dark blue there of consciousness, attitudes, and saliency is sort of where our understanding of social class comes from. So how aware are we of our social class identity? And sometimes we're not aware. And part of that is because of the class and race stratification that happens in people's lives. We grow up in neighborhoods that are stratified by race and class. We arrive on campuses and our housing might be stratified by race and class. And so when everybody sort of around you may be having similar identities or similar challenges or similar successes, it may seem that that's true for everybody in the world. And we may not even realize the sort of the social class differentiations until we get to college. Attitude is how we feel about it. Is, you know, how do I feel about my social class? Am I proud? Am I ashamed? Am I both at the same time? And the saliency is how prevalent is it for us? So among all of our identities, sort of where does social class fall in its level of importance to us? The bottom sort of three circles here talk about how our social class relates to elements of our life, right? Lifestyle is sort of how we spend our time and energy, and what does that look like? Everything from do I have one job, two jobs, four jobs, to do I believe in taking breaks, to vacation to me is visiting family, vacation to me is going to Europe, right? All of those are sort of wrapped up in lifestyle. Property relationships is what I was describing earlier with my car. Like, what is our relationship to material things? I want roll-up windows in my car, and I want to now book plane flights to go see and explore things. And I didn't fly till I was 21 years old as a college student when somebody sent me somewhere. So my relationship to travel was very different then than it is now. And then behaviors is sort of how we walk, how we talk, how we eat, how we dress, what Becky was talking about earlier. And then the sort of other three circles in the model are who we compare ourselves to. So as we think about the things Becky talked about earlier of class of origin, current felt class, and attributed class, that shows up in Liu's model as well with these different referent groups of who we're comparing ourselves to. That gets dicey for undergraduate and graduate students because there can be an ethos on college campuses sometimes of everybody is poor. That is not factual. That is not actually the case. We have some students on campus who are very poor, who experience food insecurity and housing insecurity, who don't know if they can pay their tuition bill for the fall semester, right? And we have students who say, well, I eat ramen because college students eat ramen. And so that I'm poor because my parents haven't deposited into my bank account yet this month, right? Those are different things. And so how do we help students understand that? Because their peer referent group sometimes provides muddiness in trying to understand social class. So we offer these as two models. They are not the only ways we can conceptualize this. I appreciate people in the chat. We're talking about cultural mismatch theory. Stevens et al. have a great version of that. that's pertaining to sort of social class and higher education. So there's multiple models you can use. These are two we wanted to highlight.
Yes. As I was hearing you, Sonja, speak, I remember, and this was years ago because I graduated in '94, but there was somebody that I graduated with, and our first year we're at the financial aid office, and it was this guy, and he talked about just being a regular guy, right? And, and having his family and where he was from. And then he pulled out a checkbook and he said, my parents want to pay for all 4 years so that I don't have to pay the tuition increase every year. And I about fell on the floor because I was figuring out how to pay for the rest of that semester. And he asked them, how much is the next the next 3.5 years of college, so that my parents don't have to pay the difference in tuition. And I hadn't realized how that works itself out. Like, then how did I feel about that? Right? How did I shift the referent group of myself and him and our relationship as friends? And, that's a lot to take on when you're 19 years old. Right? And still the impact that it has to me on as I'm 50. Right? And so we offer these two as not just a thinking space, but how they play themselves out, right? With students, with colleagues, with peers, with parents, as we think about community. And somebody had put, so we need to not think of parents in the deficit. Yep, right? They are bringing something to campus also. We also have to be able to support them in the anxiousness that they may feel or the out of place that they may feel because we're using acronyms, right? Because we're using language that they don't understand. And that doesn't mean that they're less than or deficit. It means that they're using a different playbook. And so let's learn about their playbook as we create community. So what we have, we're going to spend a little bit of time in this space of reflection of what's your own class story. So we have some questions here. What we want you to do is write them down, type them, just being able to put an answer in. You can also put stuff in chat. But we want you to first reflect on it. So when is the first time you recall knowing your social class, right? Go back to that, childhood memory, right? Go back to that time that, I hadn't realized, and this was a pop or an aha. Right? Of what is the first time or one of the first times you remember knowing your social class, like that you can recall. And then how would you define your class of origin, right? Your current felt class, your attributed class, right? And so, how you grew up, where you're at now, what is put on you, and what markers do you associate with them in your story or your stories? And it could be, we can even broaden that up to say, and so what markers do you associate with class, right? As you navigate your world now, as you think about your family's world, and what that was like. And usually when I say family, I'll say that meant for me class of origin, because that could be different than now. So we want you to spend like a minute writing some stuff down, drawing a picture, reflecting on this. Because we can't get you into some groups. So we want you to just do a little reflection and then be able to share with us just a little bit. Right, and I'm appreciating the people putting in the chat, right? And so Claire, when I went through the line at my grandparents' church to pick out 2 gifts for Christmas from used donated toys and books. And while that was, class-based, also the intersection that is involved, right? As we think about religion, as we think about, intergenerational, right? Or across generation.
I'll say too, I really appreciate in the chat the comments about military recruitment and college recruitment and where those are more present and where those are less present as well. I know some folks who are working on some research on geospatial mapping to look at where different folks recruit and what that means in terms of sort of race, class, and gender. So yes, that's something I think people have anecdotally seen, and people are working on some empirical data for that as well.
Wonderful. And if anybody else wants to put anything in there as you think about markers or your a little bit of your class story, We ask this of folks because many times people say they talk about class, and so they talk about it from a how to serve students. Right? They talk about it in regards to Pell Grant eligibility or financial aid or in TRIO programs. All of that is really critical. And we ask folks to share their class story, and some of them are like, this is the only time that I've done this, or I've tucked this away because of, or I've never considered or thought about because it's not something that I had to do in this way with the in-depthness of my own story. Right? And so we offer you to spend some time today, right, within the next couple of weeks, engaging in your own class story. Right? And we want to be able to give some time. And so continue to, in the chat, continue to populate that, because I think that is really important as we talk about first gen, as we talk about class, as we talk about intersections, and to develop the capacity to engage in class, knowing that it starts with our stories, which also starts with our awareness and consciousness. What we want to do is give you some information that we found through our own research.
Yeah, so I'll sort of briefly hint at what sort of 2 chapters of our book shared in terms of students' experiences with social class in higher education, and how that, where the commonalities were in their experiences. And so the themes you're seeing on this slide are from the undergraduate student chapter. So we had 3 undergraduate students write their narratives around how they were experiencing social class in the academy. So Daniel was at Chapman University in California. He identified as a Latino man, straight, able, he's 20 years old. Keviana was at the University of Memphis. She identifies as a Black woman, able, 20 years old, and a Christian. And then Tia was at Princeton. She identifies as a white woman who was bisexual and had a learning disability, and she was 21. And so during their stories, they talked about, they all also identified as first generation college students. And so they talked about sort of how their campuses were receiving them in different ways, but also how social class was showing up for them alongside the other identities they held that I just named. And so as we sort of looked at their stories and analyzed the narratives and did a narrative analysis, we sort of found the things that were on the screen that were similar about their undergraduate experiences, even though they were in different parts of the country, at different institutional types. They really talked about how the complexity of their identities and how they worked together and what showed up more so when, and all of those different pieces. And specifically, they talked about social class as being invisible, unspoken, and or misunderstood. The story that stuck with me from one of the undergraduate students from Tia at Princeton was that she said, I don't feel comfortable with my peers. Where I find home at Princeton is in the dining hall with my other folks, colleagues who work in the dining hall, and that we sort of share the social class background. And that's a space where I sort of feel I can be all of myself is in my work in the dining hall versus in the residence hall or in my classroom or those sorts of things. So really finding community in ways that we may not expect as college and university administrators, but that show up for students. They talked about straddling class and sort of what that means to for Keviana being in student government, sort of what was expected for her in student government versus what was expected for her sort of in her family, or how she preferred to present herself and those sorts of things. They talked a lot about code switching, which I appreciate somebody in the chat box was talking about that as well. And Becky talked about that earlier, like how am I talking with my family versus how am I talking in the classroom versus how am I talking at a student organization event. And so it's really interesting to sort of see how that works out. And even my partner, he will say to me sometimes, you've just been on the phone with your mom, because in those like 20 minutes I'm on the phone with my mom, I go back to maybe my preferred and natural form of speaking, which may be different than how I'm speaking today, right? And so that code switching really showed up for students, not only in their language, but in their clothing, in sort of their general behaviors around social class. And they definitely talked about the intersections of identity. So what does it mean to be a Latino man and a first generation college student in a sort of private institution at Chapman University in California? What does it mean to be a Black woman at the University of Memphis? And talking about sort of what that meant in combination with their social class. So lots of richness in their stories. And so I encourage you to check that out if you have a chance to sort of delve a little deeper into the undergraduate stories. We also had a chapter on graduate students. And so we had Dylan, who was at Colorado State, who identified as a straight white man, able, 24 years old, was a master's student and identifies as first gen, along with Connie, who is at Northeastern, who identifies as Chilean and Latina, who identifies as straight woman, Abel, 31 and Christian, and then Carmen, who identifies as Chicana or Latina, as a woman who is queer, non-disabled, and 42. And so they sort of really talked about the things you see on the screen here of being resourceful and resilient and hard work, and how Connie talks about, I moved back in with my parents at 30 so I could pursue being a doctoral student. And Dylan talked a lot about being somebody who experienced and was in collegiate recovery, or recovery. He was identified as being in recovery, and what that meant for his sort of pathway as a master's student. And so they also talked about community and responsibility, that I'm not just doing this for me, right? I'm doing this for my family. I am doing this for other people, and doing it because I want to pay it forward, right? I want to work in higher ed to pay it forward to other students who identify as first gen, or a student of color, or a student from a poor and working class background. Their racial identity was really prevalent for them as well. So Dylan talked about whiteness and white privilege. And then Connie and Carmen talked about sort of both how they would primarily identify, which may be Chilean or Chicana, but how other people were identifying them maybe as Latina. And then they also talked about educational privilege. I apologize if you're hearing my dog. Talked about educational privilege and how that the ability to go to graduate school, master's degree, doctoral degrees, really impacted their thoughts of themselves, how they interacted with their families, and then what opportunities that sort of presented for them in their future career path as well. So lots of intersections happening in these stories in the book.
Wonderful. And I'm glad your dog came on, because that's just life. Like, as I think about that, I was like, okay, that's part of this book, right? That is part of this life that we're currently living. Is, yep, Sonja's this faculty member. She's this author with stuff. She's also got a scrappy little dog in the background. So thank you for bringing life to this space. What we also want to say, especially as we think about intersections, right, is there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And Sonja and I have been very clear that our work has intersections, and that it is so critical to pull the thread within identity to see clearly how we show up. Because what can often happen is we can do the yeah, but. And so how do we be, how is our work example for me around class? I could talk about it, when in my early 30s from a very theoretical space. And not until I was doing some like deep work could I talk about it in a whole space. And what I was doing is, one, I was embarrassed, ashamed, guilt, like all these things that I felt, especially as a class straddler. And I was defaulting to being a person of color, right? And so I wasn't able to clearly see how class was showing up in my current class, right, as somebody with various capital and forms of privilege in those capital spaces, because I was doing the yeah, but. And so it is important for us to say, yep, let's pull the thread, and yep, let's think about the intersections. One of the things that we find in academia is people will default to marginalized because we want to talk about the class privilege that we have, right? And vast class privilege, and not discarding any of the other stuff, right? And so as a person of color, right, as a woman, if folks identify as queer, as disabled, as undocumented, right? All of those pieces create the tapestry, but in order to get the tapestry, we need those threads. And what we want you to do is just think about, and so what identities of mine intersect, right? Which ones do I think of? Or do I think about class much? And so for the next week, center class, right? Like, let that be a lived experience for you to center class, and then to see, so how does race intersect with class? How does my ability status, right, represent class? How about, my sexuality or my age? Those I think are getting larger for me as I'm getting older. And I didn't really think about vesting. First of all, I didn't know what the fuck vesting was when I was 30. Right. And now that I am almost 50, I was like, oh, I really wish I would have stayed at that institution for 5 years. Right. And so the intersection of class and age for me is becoming more, I'm more concerned about it. It's not something that I thought about when I was 30, but also it's not something that I learned about until I was probably 35. Right. So all of these different layers that exist. Right. And so within that, here's just a slide as we think about other identities, right? So we've got race, gender identity, sexuality, religion, faith, spirituality, age, nationality, disability, and specify. And specify has us be able to broaden it, right? Maybe it's survivor status, maybe it's geography, right? Maybe it is body image, right? There's other pieces of us besides the parts that are shown that intersect with class, right? And so, how does class stand alone for me? How do I center it? And what is intersected? And knowing that all of those play out at the same time, right? But allowing ourselves the opportunity to be clear on some ways that we engage. And we're going to offer you some action, right? Next steps.
Yeah, and I will offer, it was a great comment in the chat box about my family was considered affluent in another country, and we came to the US, we're considered middle class. And so I appreciate sort of that intersection between sort of nationality and social class, because I often think about sort of the intersections for me. So as Becky, talked about, what does it mean to be white and from a working class family? And so those sort of intersections of having the privilege of whiteness in my community, which was an extreme privilege in a sort of rural working class sort of community, because I, while my family was working class, in my PK-12 school, I was still sort of fostered into specific experiences where my classmates who were Black, that's basically the Black, biracial, and white are the races present in my hometown, were not. And so while my working class roots impacted my experiences in all kinds of ways, my whiteness lessened the impact in some ways than maybe other people in my community experience because of the intersection of race and class. And then as you were talking, Becky, the other thing came up for me that I hadn't really thought about maybe ever, I don't know, in a long time, was around religion and social class, and how being a kid, I still identify as Catholic. And so being a kid going to mass and hearing about how much you should be giving in terms of like tithing and money, and always thinking, well, we can't do that. So I don't know, like, are we Catholic enough for these people? Like, what does that mean in terms of my, like, afterlife, like all of these things. And so I really haven't thought a lot about that intersection before, and sort of how it still plays out for me in some ways as well. So new interesting thought I need to dig into today. So thank you for that. So the other sort of thing we want to think about, so as Becky has asked you to sort of center social class this week, is to offer you some ways to do that. And so as we sort of think about action planning, and you can use these questions individually for yourself, you could use them for a team, you can use them in advising meetings with students, depending on how you work with them. But this piece on reflection. And so we had you reflect a little bit here today in this session, but who do you need to discuss social class with in your life or at work? And I often think it's easier for me to do it at work and in spaces like this than with my family, particularly my parents and those sorts of things, because I don't want to come at it from an academic lens and talking about it with my family. I don't necessarily think that's helpful. And because it's not necessarily something they want to talk about. And so while I may have worked through some of my emotions and have shifted maybe from some shame to some pride and maybe some guilt even now, right? So some guilt about the opportunities that I have that especially my grandparents, who are no longer with us, but were brilliant people who just didn't have the same kind of opportunities that I did. And I know they worked hard so I could have the opportunities, but there's still guilt wrapped up in there somewhere as well. But also thinking about what do I need to explore to be more class conscious? And so, I do this work every day, and every day, most days. And I just said, I've never thought about it from the lens of religion and social class, right? And so there's more things to sort of explore and think about. And so what are those things for you that you may need to consider? In terms of learning, what might be one thing you're going to take away from this conversation today, or from the broader First Gen Institute at the University of Minnesota that's happening today? what is one thing that you might need to learn more about regarding social class? So what are you going to maybe learn today? And then what after today is sort of one thing you want to focus on. And maybe it's, how do I understand social class beyond money and finances? Maybe it is, what are the most prominent social class challenges that students are facing in my sphere of influence at the University of Minnesota? Or it might be in the broader community. How am I contributing to the broader community around issues of housing security or food security or those sorts of things? And then what identities intersect with your social class most prominently? Is it race? Is it ability? Is it age, as Becky just talked about? And so that reflection and learning sort of melding together in ways that we have to reflect in order to sort of consider the ways that we might need to advance our learning in some of these areas. And we can't do it all at once. So I wouldn't say, like, think about every intersection you've ever had around, social class and other dimensions of identity, but what are a couple that you want to sort of dig into in this process? And then sort of more practice oriented recommendations is what's one way we can shift or add to our practice to be more class conscious. And so I think about, particularly right now, around mental health care access and students on campus, because there's a limit to how many sessions a student can have with the counseling center on my campus. And so do I know in the community areas that are free or low cost for students to be able to continue their mental health supports if the campus option is no longer available to them? And so I also think about it, we're working on making sure the GRE is not a barrier. So we removed it from our admissions process, but how do we also work with the graduate school to get it sort of removed from fellowship and scholarship processes? So within your sphere, what is one way that you can do that? And then engaging social class more in your work, but also who might you need support from. So in order for us to get the GRE taken away from scholarships and fellowships, we have to have support of the graduate school at our campus. So it's not just our program and me as a faculty member to think about what am I doing, but how am I working with my colleagues to talk about social class, to see how the GRE is not only a social class issue, it's an issue with intersections of other identities, but how are we bringing this to prominence on our campus so that we can have a sort of coalition to sort of drive this change that we're looking for as well? So it's not to other points that have been made earlier, it's not a singular sort of task. It is a community-based task. And how do we start to embrace that and see that as well? So those are just some few ideas. You can take a screenshot of the slide. You may get the slides later as well, but some questions to sort of continue your work around the social class intersections with other identities, including the first gen identity. And a point I want to mention there too is that we also don't want to make assumptions that because a student is first gen, the student is also poor and working class. We can't make that automatic association because then we're not serving students well or sort of seeing the wholeness of their experience as students at the University of Minnesota. And so how do we sort of understand that some people like me experience both of those things as part of their experience and identity, but other students we don't. So if all of our programming assumes those two sort of pieces of identity are together, we're not going to serve poor and working class students who aren't first gen, and we're not going to serve first gen students who aren't poor and working class. So how do we not conflate those components of students' experiences?
Awesome. And I think we have a few minutes for questions. Right. Oh, go ahead. You just first.
Yeah. So we just want to offer some further sort of books and ways of learning. So we've been chatting from our book, Straddling Class in the Academy, that was published a couple years ago. William Liu's model I mentioned is in the book at the top called Social Class and Classism in the Helping Professions. Dr. Chris Osoria, who's at the University of Minnesota, wrote Welcoming Blue Collar Scholars into the Ivory Tower. Dr. Anthony Jack at Harvard wrote The Privileged Poor, and it's really an interesting look of how social class shows up in private higher ed spaces. But I think the points there around how sometimes our efforts to reduce class inequity create more class inequity if we aren't thinking about them in sort of broader holistic ways. A New Directions for Student Services volume that Georgiana Martin, Becky Elkins co-edited around social class, specifically in student affairs. And then Dr. Georgiana Martin and I have a book coming out in May on social class supports. It's an edited volume. There were 60 contributing authors that talked about social class supports that were actually happening on their campuses, 2-year, 4-year across the country. And so that'll be out in May.
Wonderful. And now we have a few minutes for questions. Any questions folks have, you can raise your hand. You can put a question in the chat. We want to allow some Q&A time. How about, as we're waiting, a couple of things come to mind is similar to how white folks will say that they don't have a story around race, folks from particularly class of origin with middle class plus will say, I don't really have a class story. And we invite you to dig a little deeper in that space, because you do. We could tell you what your story is, right? As folks that were in the marginalized identity that saw things, right? Just as folks of color would say, yep, you have a story as a white person, let me tell you a little bit about it. And so know that that isn't a slight, right? That is sometimes in our privileged groups, we don't consider that we have a story in our privilege. And doing the work to delve into that is really, really critical. The other thing is, it's okay to say poor and working class. Sometimes, right, people get nervous. We shouldn't say that. What does that mean? Let's have that become a norm in our institutions, right? Like, we can say poor and working class. It's okay.
We have a couple questions, Becky. So Natasha, I think, has their hand raised. So if you are able to unmute and share with us. Or Claire, you also have your hand raised. Oh, it's okay, Natasha, no worries. Claire, are you able to unmute and ask your question? Or put it in the chat box? It looks like we have a question here in the chat box. How do we combat the illusion of classlessness, that's hard to say, at the level of the institution in hiring practices, department, culture, etc.? How do we make this kind of essential reflection more than a self-selecting activity?
So how do we combat the illusion? Well, combating it is talking about it. Because what often happens is it's like that elephant that's tiptoeing and we're not let's just name it. And so being able to name the dynamic that exists. We know that with institutions, like, there are positions, there's hierarchy, right? There is skill set, there's degrees. Some of those, I can't get paid to, don't hire me for a certain thing because I can't do that, right? And let's talk about salary equity. Let's talk about, who's getting paid what. Let's talk about the value of work and what that means. And so there's some system stuff that we can engage in regards to salary or benefits or who earns what or value. And we know that we cannot pay, at least the structure says, right? We can't pay custodians the same as we can pay administrators, right? And so let's talk about that, right? And let's talk about the value of custodians, right? And how that plays itself out to be visible instead of invisible.
Yeah, I would say too, there are some interesting practices, particularly, I mean, my realm was more student affairs and sort of faculty, but more so student affairs. And it's interesting because sometimes I worked at an institution, and I've had some recent alums of our program share this as well, that they're expected, and a starting salary coming out of a student affairs master's program would somewhere be between, let's say, 35 and 45, right? On most good days. And those employees are expected to buy things and then get reimbursed by the university. So if they work in programming, they're expected to go buy all of the stuff for the event and then get reimbursed. Well, that's not very equitable, because why are we making the assumption that those folks have the ability to do that, or that they have a credit card? I remember being in college as a college student and being expected as a student org officer to buy things. And they were like, well, don't, so just put it on your credit card. I was like, I don't have a credit card. And so I think some of those practices as well, like, what assumptions are we making about the ability of folks to be able to do certain things or wear certain things, or all of these other, so like this sort of, to the first question, I think from KC, the points of also professionalism, and then how professionalism is sort of a coded framework that shows up from, sort of whiteness and patriarchy and these other pieces. And so how do we also just interrogate the construct of professionalism as well, which I think does, to your point, make people uncomfortable to talk about what that might mean, and why me showing up in a blazer is more professional than me showing up in what I'm wearing now, which is a sweater, and you can't see, but I'm wearing jeans. And so what does all of that mean as well? So there's lots of, I think, ways to do that. And to your point about not making it just a self-selected activity, I think that's hard with all sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion work and social justice work, is how do we make people care? And I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I don't know if you do either, Becky, but like, I think that I think showing, for some people, it's showing them sort of the bottom line. How is this impacting the bottom line, whether that's retention of employees or retention of students? And I want it to come from an altruistic place, but it doesn't always. And so how do we also understand the business imperative and how to make the argument from the business lens, in addition to sort of the ethic of care lens as well?
Yeah, there's a question around, is poor working class a better term to use than low income student? You know, so terminology. I think that that's what exists is, like, what term do I use? I think for you, so figure out what term you use best for yourself. And as we work with students, as we work with staff and colleagues, also ask them what term works best for them. Right? Because what happens is we make the assumption that we don't have a which one's better or worse to use. Right? What we have is, what do we mean by? And so when I say low income student, like, what do I mean by that? What does the institution mean by that? Right? What is the definition that we're using? When I say poor and working class, what is the meaning we have about that? And how can I be very clear about what that meaning is in our department, in our division, right, on our team? And sometimes folks use them interchangeably. Pay attention to that if that happens. Right, because we traffic in language, and that's something to pay attention to. Am I talking about, when I say low income, then am I talking about just money?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. That's where I like. I don't think there's a better or worse term. I think people are more comfortable with low income, and so I think they're more comfortable because they feel like it's less direct. It's still direct, but I don't know. They feel like it's less something.
Yep.
And what I am challenged by is then we're only talking about money. Often when we talk about just income and not the sort of broader understanding of social class around the terms poor and working class. And to Becky's point from earlier, that makes some people uncomfortable, and we've gotten pushback in our writing or conference proposals or things like that because people are uncomfortable with those terms. So I would encourage you to use the broader terms and use whatever term gets the conversation happening. I think that is all of our time.
Yeah, I think we are a minute over.
Thank you so much to our keynote speakers for your insights and conversation.